the C.N.D. say they're the peace movement. They've sort of hijacked the word. I actually think that the peace movement, the real peacekeepers, the people upon whom peace depends, are a number of people. First of all, the men and women in our armed services. Secondly, the politicians that take the decisions and have taken the decisions consistently under Labour and Conservative governments ever since the 1940s. So that's the group of people who really keep the peace.
Tonight, the Secretary of State for Defence, Mr. Michael Heseltine, at the end of a week in which the arguments over nuclear disarmament have gained pace. We've had President Reagan's latest offer to the Soviet Union, and now we're on the eve of a weekend in which the peace movement in Britain is planning its biggest ever demonstration. The build-up at Greenham Common started this morning. Greenham Common in Berkshire is one of the two proposed bases for the United States cruise missiles, and it's the chief Easter attraction for women C.N.D. campaigners from all over the country. The women protesters arrived early on foot, by car, bus and coach. Lots of police were there to escort the occasional vehicle out of the camp, but most of the time the women were allowed to sit, and unprotesting, the police stood and watched. 14 miles away at the nuclear warhead arms factory at Burfield, men and women protesters staged a Mad Hatter's tea party. Tomorrow, the two sites will be joined by a human chain, protesting particularly against the cruise missiles. The 160 cruise missiles based in Britain will have the range to strike deep into Warsaw Pact territory, including Moscow. The debate is over the balance of the medium-range missiles placed in Europe. In the east at the moment are 350 SS-20 rockets, each with 3 nuclear warheads. Roughly two-thirds face or could face Europe, and could hit virtually every capital city. By December, it's proposed to place a total of 464 cruise missiles based in Britain, Italy, West Germany, and possibly Holland and Belgium, together with a total of 108 Pershing II missiles in West Germany. Today, Mr. Heseltine paid a visit to the symbolic heart of the whole East-West argument, to the city of Berlin and the Berlin Wall. Before he went, he came into the TVI studio. Mr. Heseltine, President Reagan seems to be changing his tune again over nuclear disarmament. Is that because of pressure from Europe?
I don't think he has changed his tune. I think he started off where most of us would want to be, which is offering to deploy no weapons if the Russians would remove the equivalent class of weapon, the SS-20 missile that they have facing us. That's obviously the right solution. That's what we'd all like to see. Well, the Russians won't accept that. And so what does President Reagan do? He considers, he consults, he reaches a judgment. And I think the response he's made today is the right one. He said to the Russians, right, we can't achieve the best result because you won't. Well, we're prepared to take a very flexible approach, and we are prepared to negotiate a fair and reasonable and verifiable lesser number than you're offering, but we must in fact ensure that it's seen to be a genuine response to the opportunities that exist. So I think that President Reagan has taken the right response, indeed the only one that is possible in the face of the Russians' unwillingness to reach the sort of zero option which we'd like.
But are we really consulted about this? I mean, Mrs. Thatcher indicated in the House on Tuesday that in fact President Reagan didn't consult her over, say, the whole laser operation.
Well, that's very different, but because it's a very, very long-term idea. It's a question of research into a possibility, and it's something that as the President himself has made clear, might or might not happen sometime in the next century. But on the question which we're now talking about, which is the new offer in Geneva, we certainly were consulted, certainly played a part in it, and I believe the other NATO allies were properly consulted as well. It's very important, I think, from the American point of view, and we feel this, that we should in fact act as a team.
But did you yourself ever really think that the zero option was going to be accepted?
Well, we had doubts, but that doesn't mean to say we were wrong to offer it, because the object of the exercise is to try and get the best possible deal. It is the best deal to have no missiles of that sort on the landmass of Europe. So we would have been much criticised if we hadn't tried to get it, but we haven't succeeded at this stage. So then you have to take the second best option.
A lot of people say that multilateral disarmament has not succeeded, and that's why they have become unilateralists.
Well, it has succeeded in one sense, that we have preserved the peace in Western Europe for 37, nearly 38 years, a time without precedent. So to the extent that we have succeeded in our first ambitions, which was to preserve peace, the policies of the last 4 decades have worked. So I don't think anyone can say that there's any alternative but to consider that those policies are the right ones and to continue them.
But many people do say there are alternatives. The campaign for nuclear disarmament will be very active this weekend. They've been revivified by the cruise missile. And what is your answer? Haven't they been winning the argument?
Well, they're going to gamble, aren't they? Because our policies have worked, and they want to get rid of our policies. They want the C.N.D. They have a number of objectives. They want us to get out of NATO. They want us to get rid of the nuclear backup to our conventional strength. And they want Britain to give up its own independent nuclear deterrent. Now, those are gambles. All of them are gambles. And gambles they want to put in place of a policy that has worked. We've kept the peace and we've deterred the Soviet Union.
But I think for the public, they are the peace people. Theirs is the peace movement. No, why don't people say that your successful deterrent, as you would say, is a peaceful deterrent?
Well, the interesting thing is the C.N.D. say they're the peace movement. They've sort of hijacked the word. I actually think that the peace movement, the real peacekeepers, the people upon whom peace depends, are a number of people. First of all, the men and women in our armed services. Secondly, the politicians that take the decisions and have taken the decisions consistently under Labour and Conservative governments ever since the 1940s. So that's the group of people who really keep the peace. The fact that some rather clever people with words, good propagandists, hijack the words, doesn't mean to say they really keep the peace. I mean, let me ask you, it's not your job to answer questions, but put a simple point to you. The only real major threat we face comes from the Kremlin. If you were looking at the Western world through the eyes of those very cold, calculating men in the Kremlin, who would you regard as the people keeping the peace in the Western world? The protesters, the marchers, C.N.D., or the deterrents of the Western world, the NATO alliance? I've no doubt where I think the peace is being kept.
But the leader of the Labour Party, Mr. Foote, would say it was the arms race itself which was the greatest threat to peace.
Michael Foote has said that ever since I've been in active politics, and he's been rejected by every government, including every Labour government, throughout the whole time he's said it. So the real thing we have to ask is what's changed? Have our policies failed? Well, they haven't, because we've kept the peace. Has the Soviet threat changed? Well, patently it hasn't, because they have a larger military capability and nuclear capability than ever before. So what has changed? The Labour Party has changed. It has been, if you like, moved substantially to the left, and people like Michael Foote, whose policies have been rejected by every Labour government, have now taken over. The interesting thing is, the last poll I saw on the subject showed that 66% of Labour voters disagree with the defence policies of the Labour Party, and I'm not surprised.
But there's a 2-to-1 majority in opinion polls against having the cruise missiles in this country. Now, what motivates those people?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and one I've certainly given a lot of attention to. You see, what you have with absolute certainty, far bigger majorities in favour of the assertion that we should have nuclear deterrence and a British independent nuclear deterrent. There are very big majorities of public opinion in favour of those two propositions. But when you then say, now this is the weapon system that we intend to introduce to give effect to those policies, people back off. They have doubts, anxieties. And you can't blame them, because they see in those weapons the full horror of the nuclear capability. But if you're in my position, or the position of any government, any defence minister, you actually have not only to believe in the nuclear deterrent and the British deterrent, you have got to take decisions about what weapon systems will make it effective. And so the interesting thing is that in the early 60s, when the present nuclear deterrents were being turned into weapon systems, there was the same sort of support for the campaign for nuclear disarmament at that time. And then, when people got used to the fact that the systems existed, the support waned away. Now, when we have to modernize and update those weapon systems, there's an increase in public anxiety. But there is absolutely no wavering in the mainstream of public opinion, which is to defend the NATO alliance, the need for nuclear deterrence, and the British independent deterrent.
But don't you agree that the West still has a superiority in strategic nuclear weapons over the Soviet Union?
Well, you can debate that, and you can argue whether, in fact, the particular class of weapon systems equals or is less than or larger than the Soviet Union. There is, in fact, something not very far away from a balance. But the difficulty about this whole situation is that constantly one or other of the superpowers has to consider whether or not its deterrence or its capability is credible in the light of what others are doing. And people say, well, that's an arms race. And in a sense, of course, there is a need to keep up with what the other chap is doing, unless you can secure agreement. And what you can't do, what you dare not do, is ever get to a position where you think that your potential aggressor is ahead. Now, what we are doing is to deal with, at one class of weapons, the intermediate range weapon, a very positive Soviet threat. They have SS-20 missiles, something 350 missiles, something over 1,000 warheads, now facing us, probably 2/3 of them facing Western Europe at this time. They're there. We've got no equivalent to that. Now what do? Do you allow that situation to exist, or do you say to the Soviets, unless you will negotiate to reduce that number, preferably to remove it, we have got no choice but to deploy an equivalent system so that you will never dare take the risk of using your system? Now that's the position. We don't want to do it. The whole of the negotiations at Geneva are designed to avoid it. But if the Soviets won't see sense, by the end of this year, the Western European alliance, reluctantly, will have to deploy the cruise missile and the Pershing II systems.
But that's your deterrent. And is it really the only choice? If first you can blow up the world many times over, doesn't that, in fact, be a deterrent? And secondly, don't Britain and France have their own strategic nuclear deterrent, which presumably would be used if the Soviet Union moved into Western Europe? Are they not enough to deter the Soviet Union?
I think the difficulty is that you have to be sure that at any level of attack you have a credible response. What you wouldn't want to be in a position of doing is to rely ultimately on the strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles represented by, for example, in our case, the Polaris submarine systems, because that is such a scale of nuclear riposte that it is arguable that the Soviets might think we'd never used it if they just used an intermediate range and much more precise nuclear attack.
Are you saying, Mr. Heseltine, that either the Soviet Union or the United States is actually planning a nuclear war in Europe and nowhere else?
No, I'm not saying that.
But is that not the logical consequence of your actually saying we have got to reinforce the nuclear warheads in Central Europe?
No, I don't think there's any credibility to that argument, because you see, it was the Western Europeans that asked to have the cruise missile and the Pershing II systems deployed in Europe. It wasn't the Americans. So the idea that they were planning it doesn't stand up to examination, because it was originally Chancellor Schmidt who first raised as a politician this into the public domain. We were concerned in Western Europe that the Soviets were deploying a weapons system, the SS-20s, that had an effect on Western Europe and might therefore tempt them to use it in Western Europe in a sense that might have left the Americans feeling that they weren't particularly involved in that. We were particularly concerned to ensure that there was a land-based missile system on the continent of Europe which countered the threat that now exists from the Soviet Union. That's why the Europeans first took the view that it was necessary to ask the United States to deploy the cruise missiles. It was not the United States who asked us.
How many American military bases are there in Britain?
Oh, I couldn't give you the answer to that question without looking it up, but I mean, we have a significant number, obviously.
What's a significant number? I mean, I think the parliamentary answers have varied from about 8 to 32, and some people would say it was more than double that.
Well, the fact of the matter is that we do have agreements with the Americans for the basing of their nuclear weapons here, and these arrangements have gone on for a significant period of time, since, of course, the forming of the NATO alliance.
But if the Americans know where the bases are, and the Soviet Union knows where the bases are, why shouldn't the British public?
But the fact of the matter is that we wouldn't automatically announce the details of what we use particular bases for, because obviously there's a strategic value in that.
But the Russians know.
Well, if the Russians know, then the British public presumably know.
Well, presumably the British public should be told rather more openly, shouldn't they?
Well, but you're presupposing that the Russians do have this information, and I don't think it'd be right for me as Secretary of State to broadcast on a major and important television company information of this sort.
The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, has indicated in the House that he thinks it would be a good idea to negotiate a dual control over the cruise missiles in this country. But you said that would cost £1,000 million. No,
the Foreign Secretary has never said anything of the sort.
The Foreign Secretary
what he
has
said.
No.
What the Foreign Secretary said in reply, if I remember correctly, to an intervention from the opposition benches, is that he was aware that people in some cases believed this. A number of people believed
including
this,
Conservative MPs.
But he didn't in any way suggest that he believed it, because, of course, he was deeply involved in the decisions that were taken in 1979, leading to the decision to deploy the cruise missiles here. Now, at that time, the issue was carefully considered by this particular government as to whether there should be some system of dual control, a physical engineering dual control over the cruise missiles. And there was no doctrinal view about this. There's no issue of principle at stake. What the government had to decide is whether they were satisfied with the existing arrangements that we have with the Americans for the control of American systems based in Britain. And these arrangements have existed for a long period of time. We've already got, as everybody knows, American nuclear systems based in Britain. We have the F-111 bombers and we have the Poseidon submarines. And we have an agreement with the Americans which was negotiated in the early 1950s by the American President, Mr. Truman, and the British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, which makes it...
Mr. Attlee.
Yes, but confirmed by Sir Winston Churchill at that time, which confirms categorically that these American systems based on British bases will not be used without the joint decision of the American President and the British Prime Minister. And every time one of those office holders changes, whether it be the President or the Prime Minister, they reaffirm their agreement to these provisions. Now, as we've got American systems here, as we believe they're satisfactory, there didn't seem to be any case in saying in the context of the cruise missile system that we wanted a new arrangement, because that would be to imply that we weren't satisfied with the arrangements which Labour and Conservative governments since 1952 have been perfectly satisfied with.
That may be an answer for politicians, Mr. Heseltine, but I think for plain people, the Americans are saying that the missiles are owned and operated by the United States, and the United States is paying for them.
Yes.
Are you actually saying Mrs. Thatcher could stop them being used?
But the Americans themselves have entered into a written agreement with us, which I've read out in the House of Commons, and I think the Prime Minister herself has referred to, which says that they will not use them. And that is an absolutely categoric assurance. It is a joint decision between those two office holders.
It's a decision in the light of the circumstances prevailing at the time. I think those are the words of the Truman-Attlee decision. But what are the circumstances? Half a dozen people in dressing gowns?
Oh, no. The decisions prevailing at the time refer to the decision that will be taken by the two office holders. In other words, they will take a joint decision in the light of the circumstances of the time. It isn't in some way qualifying the absolute nature of the assurance. And if you read the document, I think that is the only interpretation that can be placed on it.
Are you satisfied that the cruise missile works?
Well, of course. I mean, I was actually very much involved in discussions with the American Defense Secretary last week, in which he was briefing the NATO defense ministers about the tests through which it's going. He was showing us clearly how the tests are proceeding satisfactorily, showed us films of them working. And the Americans would never dream of risking a weapon system that didn't work. I mean, it isn't as though the Americans are in a sort of vacuum. There are 500,000 of them on the land base of Europe. Very important it is that they're there. So the Americans aren't taking some sort of risk which just affects Europe. It is a risk, if it were to be one, and I don't think for a minute there would be one, which deeply involves themselves.
But there is a view that the missile is not totally proved. I think that's also a view of some people in the United States. Now, why are you hastening on the installation of such a missile before it's really gone through all the proving systems that you would have, say, for British missiles?
But I don't think for a minute that that is the situation. And, of course, as you appreciate, the major British missiles that you mentioned actually are those that we buy from the United States, where they go through American testing procedures. I don't think it is conceivable that the Americans would deploy a weapon system which had not gone through the most stringent of tests, and I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they've ever done that, and it would be inconceivable that they would themselves take a risk which must lead to massive potential danger to them. If you take the ultimate and most cynical view, I take the view they wouldn't risk it even if it affected us, but if you wanted to be totally cynical, it's inconceivable that they could themselves not suffer immensely if such a risk was to be taken.
It's not a matter of trying to get the cruise missiles in before the next general election in this country and before the peace movement in Europe makes further gains.
But we, in fact, took the decision in 1979 to deploy during 1983, and that was a published decision. And, of course, the interesting thing when you start talking about elections is that the Germans have had their election, And all of this was carefully discussed in the German debate that went on at the election time. And the public, despite all the forecasts, actually very much reinforced the views of the NATO alliance.
On major weapons, which you mention, Britain is still going to go ahead to buy the Trident missile, and that puts up the number of nuclear warheads, I believe, from 64 to 512. Is that not a remarkable escalation, just when, say, President Reagan is saying we've got to reduce the number of warheads?
Well, the Americans, of course, have just reduced by 1,000 the number of warheads they have in Western Europe, and there's a continuing review of the number of warheads that should be deployed, and that's before we get into the sort of negotiations that we'd like to see taking place in Geneva. But in terms of the British independent nuclear deterrent, which at present is represented by the Polaris submarines, it is to be replaced in the 1990s by the Trident submarine
by
system.
An escalation.
And it will have, although the number of launches would be the same, the number of warheads would be larger. But as a proportion of the number of warheads of that class that will be around at that time, it is in fact remaining very much within the same proportions as existed at the time of the Polaris situation. And what we have to think about, consider very carefully, is that the Soviet preventative systems, defensive systems, with all the advances of technology that they possess, are now more able to detect and prevent the penetration of their air systems by missiles from outside. So you have to have the possibility of a larger number of warheads in order to be credible as a deterrent. But let's be absolutely clear about one thing. We have made it absolutely clear in the West that we will never attack. We are not an aggressive and attacking alliance. We are a defensive alliance.
But have
and
we
the
not
purpose, let me just finish this point, the purpose of all our military thinking is to make it clear to the Soviets they can never win if they attack us. We will not attack them.
But if the Soviet Union were, by some means, to come into a conventional war, this is what the C.N.D. would say, the West has to use nuclear weapons first. Should we not be putting the money on Trident and on Cruise and so on into conventional weapons?
But I think one hasn't therefore looked at the scale of the conventional forces of the Soviet Union.
No, I think it's a question of trying to avoid accidents, isn't it, really, Mr. Heseltine? You see, you have an agreement, say, about bombers, which could be recalled in the days of Churchill.
Yes.
You have an agreement about submarines, which can be kept in touch with and stopped. The question about these missiles going off, I think, to many plain people, is simply, once the button is pressed, they cannot be recalled.
Oh, but I mean, once you've fired the missile from a submarine, it can't be recalled, and once you've fired the missile from a bomber,
but this is all very different from the previous agreement.
It's covered by exactly the same agreement, and is just as effective under the new systems as under the old. Once you've fired the missile, from whatever point you fire it, it can't be recalled, whether it's from a submarine or a bomber or whatever it may be.
But would you be happier as one of the people who'd have to take the agreement that in fact it was a conventional forces problem that you had to discuss?
Of course one would be happier, except in the context of knowing that in the present disposition of Soviet conventional forces, there is no way that the Western democracies would be prepared to put a sufficient number of people under arms or to build up their defense commitments to the scale, in conventional terms, that could deter the Soviet Union. For example, this country spends just over 5% of its national product on defense. The Soviet Union spends 15%. The Soviet Union has something between 3 and 4 million people under arms. And once you start talking in the figures that we all know to be their conventional capability, there is no conceivable deterrent that the Western world can put in the field in a democratic, free society that would deter the conventional forces of the Soviet Union. And that is what has happened, of course, time and again. They've used their conventional forces. The only reason that we've stopped them in the NATO alliance is because they know that at any level, conventional or nuclear, they can never win an aggressive attack against the West, and for 37 years they've never done it. And I believe that any change from that would be a gamble.
Thank you, Mr. Heseltine.
Thank you.